The Honorable Michael Chertoff, Secretary of Homeland Security.
Thank you very much for that kind introduction. I like that mention of where I went to school. That's designed to cultivate the Boston connection here. Also, as you probably realize, I arranged for the weather to be gloomy. That way I didn't have to compete with golf or tourism for purposes of my remarks. Anyway, I'm delighted to be here. I'm really delighted to have had a second opportunity now to address this group. I want to thank Donna Stone and Joe Hackney for greeting me and escorting me up here, and it's an honor to be here with all of you. As I know you know, this job of protecting our homeland is a shared responsibility. It's one which obviously has an important federal component, but also has a very important state and local component. And probably my department, as much as any other federal department, and maybe more than most, gets its work done through a partnership with state and local officials. That's because we share authorities, we share responsibilities, and to some extent we share assets. In fact, a good many of the assets that we protect and the people who we are trying to serve are really in the hands of state and local officials, and therefore we have to do our work with you and through you. Not surprisingly, these responsibilities present us with a lot of tough choices. And one of the reasons I always enjoy speaking to a group like this is because I think you, like me, understand that often in making a decision, what you're doing is selecting among a number of imperfect alternatives. If there was one clear, easy answer to a problem, it wouldn't take a lot of discussion. But most problems require some hard choices in terms of priorities, hard choices in terms of how we spend limited resources and how we divide them up, hard choices in how we reconcile the need for security, our desire to continue to foster freedom and liberty, and also the need to make sure that we do not impair our prosperity. So let me take three areas very quickly to talk about how we are trying to work with you to reconcile these various priorities. The first is something that I think you've been discussing in this conference, and that's the question of secure documentation and secure identification. You know, the September 11th Commission, when they reviewed the events leading up to September 11, 2001, made the following finding. Sources of identification are the last opportunity to ensure that people are who they say they are and to check whether they are terrorists. What this act requires. I think we actually do have a lot of agreement on this, but I also think there are some areas where we can work together to narrow some of the gaps. Again, the fundamental principle is this. We are not requiring or mandating that driver's licenses or driving privileges become a federal document or a federal responsibility. What we are doing, and what Congress did, frankly, in passing this law, is recognizing that the reality in the 21st century is people rely on their driver's licenses in many cases as their principal form of identification for all kinds of non-driving issues. And that includes getting on airplanes, getting into federal buildings, and other kinds of matters that are federal responsibilities. If we are going to accept those licenses for those other purposes, then I think we do have a right and an obligation to see that those licenses do in fact reflect the identity of the person who's presenting them. A federal database. What it contemplates is using existing databases and systems that we've worked on with your Association of Motor Vehicle Administrators and having those systems interconnect and interlock so that when we have driver's licenses issued by states, it's possible to check those databases to verify simple things like birth identification and other documentation that's being presented to support the driver's license. So I think these are all things I believe we can agree upon. On the other hand, I do recognize there are some challenges. There are financial challenges, And of course, the immigration bill that we tried to get passed earlier this year would have had a big slug of money to help pay for some of these real ID costs. We're going to work with Congress in general to see that the federal government is able to pick up a large share of what I call the back office, the networking that will interconnect and allow you to travel into the different databases to check what has to be checked. Real ID compliant licenses, then the state cannot expect that those licenses will be accepted for federal purposes. That means that the state's citizens will have to rely on some other form of identification, a passport, a military ID, or one of a number of other. Drivers, if your citizens are presenting state driver's licenses and saying, we want to get a federal benefit with the license, then we need to have a kind of license we can rely upon. Let me, before I move on to the last subject, say this. I think this is actually more than just a benefit for federal security. I think it's a benefit for privacy. Back when I went to college, which is quite a while ago, and I don't think it's gotten any harder to do this, anybody could get a driver's license by walking into the equivalent of a convenience store or talking to your friends. Circulated what we are calling our new national response framework. It's not currently in effect. We are still working under National Response Plan, what I call 2.0. 1.0 was issued in late 2004. 2.0 was significantly revised after Katrina and is the current operative document. This document, which is 3.0, is being circulated for comment and will ultimately, after comments are assimilated and changes are made, be the operative document going into next year. I want to talk a little bit about how this document was developed because I do think it exemplifies partnership. We had 700 stakeholders, that's federal, state, local, and private parties, deeply involved in 12 working groups working on this framework and the multiple supporting plans that go underneath it. We have circulated it widely. We've circulated the new draft, which was recently put together. We expect to get comments on that. We've had 600 already. So now let me take a couple questions.
And we do have some folks that want to ask a question. I believe Senator Bruce Starr from Oregon, and then Representative Sharon Kimiko Santos would like to ask a question. Senator?
Thank you. Mr. Secretary, later this morning, the legislators here will be voting to reaffirm a policy statement that urges the federal government to fix and fund the Real ID by December 31st, or NCSL will call for a repeal. I have two related questions relating to the department's position on fixing and funding Real ID. First, as you know, the department's estimates that the cost of implementing Real ID exceed $14 billion. And for example, the 5-year re-enrollment period. Would you be willing to join with NCSL and the governors in asking Congress to make these changes?
Well, let me begin by saying that let me answer the second question first. I think that obviously one of the reasons we've been a little delayed in the regulations is we've been actually doing a lot of outreach work and talking to state legislators and governors and state officials to try to reflect some of their concerns. Where we have identified issues that should be fixed and a little bit more flexibility, a number of states, including the biggest states, have heartily endorsed Real ID and are on board to get on board with it. So I don't think it's been a complete negative reaction. Our states like California, New York, Arizona are very interested in and are making progress toward Real ID. I think the balance we're going to have to hear is this. Quite frankly. I do think we need to listen and make some changes and adjustments and make sure we do our fair share of the funding. At the same time, there are some people who are philosophically opposed to the whole thing, and I don't think we can afford to derail this. So I would say that as we work together to come up with flexibility in fixing and funding that the consensus believes we need to get this thing done, I think it's got to come in the context of a reaffirmation of the goal of Real ID.